Now, there's a lot of things that I wanted to add to this list, but I wanted to keep it short. So I just kept it at the 6. And, even with the 6, I had to edit myself down because there is a lot that I wanted to say, but it would just be too long. So let's get started. Number 1, party members. More specifically, the effectiveness of party members in combat. So in 15, I'm not talking about taking control of them or telling them to do abilities, because that doesn't exist in 16. I'm talking more about their normal, whatever they decided they do on their own type of damage. So these are things that Noctis can't control. I just know that I can stand there with Noctis and not contribute anything, and my party members will still kill things or do at least noticeable damage to a boss, bounty, whatever it is that we're fighting. It feels very much like a party. We're on a team. In 16, you notice pretty early that it's the Clive show. He does 99% of the damage in any fight. Clive's party members are just there to keep him company and appear in cutscenes, whatever. They don't really help. And, it's a shame because they are not normal people. Sid, Jill, Joshua, they're all dominants, and they could turn into icons just like Clive. Even Torgal, all his Fenrir abilities, which we have no control over either, don't do much damage. And it's pretty sad considering what they all are. But I did notice that going up the tower in the DLC, combat with them felt a little better because I think they may have been buffed to do a little bit more damage. And I noticed it. I don't want them to do like any amazing type damage because I like the Clive show. All Clive all day, right? I'm all for the Clive show. I just wanted to feel like they're contributing something so it feels like a party. And the fact that they can't get hurt and can't die, which I do like, might be why they are so weak. But that's not a good enough reason, especially when Phoenix Down exists. I mean, not in this game, of course. Second thing about 15 is that party members don't get in the way when I try to dodge or roll away. It can get pretty clustered up around enemies on most fights because everyone's in there, with their weapons. But, I don't think I've ever gotten hit because of any of them being next to me or not moving. In 16, they totally get in the way. You may have noticed for yourself that there have been times when you try to dodge and you know that there's no way that you shouldn't have gotten hit, but somehow you get hit anyway. That's because someone is probably standing next to Clive or both sides of Clive, and they don't move out of the way. They're pretty much like a wall. And the last thing is party banter and conversations. The whole time in 15, they're constantly talking to each other. Even during combat and dungeons, out in the open world, in the car, they're reacting to what they see in the world as well. In 16, it's really rare to have party banter outside of a cutscene. And the times that it did happen, it was mostly in the beginning of the game with Sid. Because Sid talked a lot to Clive when they were out doing things together. Now, I did notice again in the DLC, they did have more conversation while they were going up the tower. But, I was kind of disappointed in the DLC when we got to the landing on the tower, and you can go to the ledge and you can see Rosalith and Port Isolde and the majority of Rosaria, and no one had anything to say about it, and it was a pretty nice view. The only comment that was made was about the airships and about Mid would be nice if she could see them, but that wasn't even conversation. That was like a mini cutscene. They didn't say that while they were walking. Next up, the time skip. The time skip in 15 happens pretty late in the game. I think it was handled pretty well, being so late in the game. The fact that it was unexpected to Noctis, it kind of helps the world of Ruin unfold to us. Like, he comes out of the crystal, and we have immediate control over Noctis. And as the world is unfolding to him, it's also unfolding to us. Golden Key is deserted. There's creatures everywhere. You have to fight your way out. It's dark. And eventually, he runs into Talcott. And, we get brought up to speed about what's happening in the current world. And I didn't feel robbed of those 10 years. I felt very robbed in 16 of those 5 years. It took us so long to get control of Clive. It never sat right with me when we went from the crystal and losing Sid, meeting Ultima, Joshua showing up, and most of this is all cutscenes. And then, of course, it's more cutscenes to 5 years later, and then we get immediately put into a fight, which is more cutscenes as we arrive to the new hideaway, and then we finally get control of Clive, only to find out that nothing has changed in the world. And I know the whole outlaw thing that was, happened, I guess during the 5 years, but that didn't really change anything. Next up, character growth. For this one, I'm going to start with 16. Older Clive is very one-dimensional to me. I mean, I could be wrong, but to me, he feels very one-dimensional. And younger Clive seems to have more depth to him. Younger Clive was struggling with guilt and revenge and loss. All he wanted to do is avenge Joshua. The similarities between younger Clive and older Clive is that neither one of them can see anything outside of their mission or what they're trying to do. Everything else just doesn't matter. And there's a huge disconnect for me between younger Clive and older Clive. They're like two very different people. And whatever did happen to Clive, it must have occurred between those 5 years that we didn't get. I guess when younger Clive accepted defeat, that may have triggered a change in Clive, but we weren't there to see the outcome of that. Clive couldn't do it at all again for those 5 years until we got to Drake's Breath. So we don't even get to experience what happened to Clive that made him into the person that we spent the most time with. Focusing solely on older Clive, he's a good fighter, but he's not a good leader, especially between Canver and Waloed. All he wanted to do was fight, or he freed it up. He might be written this way deliberately. Way back at the beginning of the game, Tiamat, he said something like, our kind doesn't think, all we do is follow orders. And Clive even tells Jill that all he did, during that time was just do missions and he couldn't do anything else. And Clive was branded, and he's been living his life as a bearer for 13 years. So thinking about all the bearers that we tried to help and rescue, they're very broken. They don't know what to do with themselves when they're free. They can't think for themselves. Someone always was telling them what to do and how to live. And this is Clive, to an extent. That was his life. And of course, they didn't have him out there stoking the fires all day. Thanks to his mom, at least, he was a soldier. So he's not as broken as they are. When he met Sid became the one telling him what to do and what to fight for. With Sid gone, the talk is still honoring Sid, creating the world that Sid wanted. This is not what Clive wanted. Clive is just going to stay on this path that Sid set out for him. And throughout the game, he doesn't take in anything about what he sees in the world. He doesn't see the consequences of his actions. Destroying the mother crystals have consequences. Not only does it bring the excess ether to the surface, creating all this Akashic, the true consequences of destroying them don't come to light until the very end of the game. The only thing that gave Clive any death, of course, was anything that has to do with Joshua. But still, he didn't learn anything else. It's pretty much who he is. Unfortunately, we didn't spend a lot of time with teenage Clive to see what kind of person he was before all the events. The only thing we know is that he was close with Joshua and that he didn't participate in the celebrations. And I guess you could say he was just duty bound back then. But, even if that's the case, it just means that he's always been this way, and there was like no change for him. Then the Hideaway itself, Clive recreates Sid Hideaway when he could have this whole province to make it a place for people to be free. Sylvester didn't care about Rosaria. There's no real imperial presence there outside of what his mom has, right? So all those destroyed and deserted towns could have been rebuilt, but Clive doesn't see it. He even went to the gates of Rosalis and he saw all these Rosarians begging and pleading for help and entry, and none of that means anything to him. It doesn't do anything to him. He just sticks to his mission and that's it. But it takes people like Martha and Wade to try to help the people that's there. I think even Uncle Byron, he said something like that to Clive as well, and Clive just wasn't interested. And so Clive just wants to send everyone to the Hideaway, just like Sid did. That's his solution. And the ones that he doesn't send to the Hideaway, they don't want his help. Freeing them hasn't been helping them at all. And even when he's told this, he just continues to do it. The key thing I find is that Clive can only see the goal that he's trying to achieve, but he's a little bit blind to all the things that's happening along the way. Younger Clive and older Clive, they may have had different goals, but it would have been nice to see older Clive kind of evolve from that a little bit. So moving on to 15, when we first met Noctis, he's just whiny, pain in the butt, not too likable person. Noctis is a very emotional person, as we find out. He gets very upset and hurt, and he cares about his friends. Throughout the events of the game, Noctis is pretty much forced to grow up. He loses his dad, which he takes a lot harder than he lets on. He finds out this whole side of things that Regis never told him from court that he has to do now that he's king. So he has to start putting duty in front of emotion, and which is very difficult for him, unlike Clive. He has a hard time putting duty first. Early game, Noctis gripes a lot about what he has to do. Any talk about him being king or prince, is met with a lot of resentment in Noctis's responses. The first real peek at a change in Noctis is how he handles negotiations in Altissia. For the first time in his life, he has to be king and he has to act like the king. After that, he has a pretty hard time. He lost Regis, he lost Luna. Ignis loses his sight trying to save him, and later on, he loses Prompto. And after all this loss, he really turns it around. Mainly after talking to Gatiana/Shiva. And by the time they reach Niflheim, Noctis finally has accepted his duty, and he stops whining about things. He stops resenting his father, and he finally puts that ring on. And he's clearly no longer the person that left Insomnia. Of course, older Noctis is a completely different place when he returns. But we get to see where Noctis was for those 10 years. We see who he's with, and we know why he's there. So when he finally comes out of the crystal, he's just a little younger than Clive. Conflict. Continuing with 15, this will touch back on Noctis with things that he was going through. Most of the conflict was between Gladio and Noctis. Early game, I completely agree with Gladio. Noctis was just so whiny and reluctant. Gladio did try to help him out a lot, but unfortunately, his directness was totally making Noctis more combative. They had their first real rift early on, back on the way to Titan. They were making these nippy conflicts for each other the entire way during the actual gameplay. And of course, Noctis finally listens to Gladio. The second rift happened on the train to Tenebrae. Gladio came down pretty hard on Noctis. This time Gladio was totally in the wrong. And this rift lasted for like 2 or 3 chapters. Those chapters were short, but I felt really bad for Noctis. I don't know what the time frame in this game is, but I'm gonna say the span of a couple months. So Noctis probably leaves home for the first time. Reece just knows something, obviously. He tries to give his son the best goodbye that he can give. Noctis, of course, is being a total jerk about it. Obviously, they have a very fractured relationship. Noctis goes off. By the time they reach Golden Key, he finds out his father is dead. He gets very upset. Later, he starts resenting him because he never told him all this stuff when he's not prepared. He finds out he has to get these weapons and blessings and all this other stuff is thrust upon him. He's constantly surrounded by his friends, which is good sometimes, but Noctis never really had any self-time. He never had time to process anything or to even grieve. So then all this stuff happens in Altissia. It's like a total breaking point for him. And here comes Gladio coming down super hard on him on top of that. And it's just too much. And it was definitely the wrong time for it. And finally, eventually, Ignis gets fed up with both of them. He tells Gladio to back off. Ignis is pretty much the voice of reason. And he sets them all straight. And finally, they can move on from it. In 16, there is no conflict. No one has a different opinion. No one thinks anything is wrong. It's one big happy family at the hideaway. Everything that they're doing is just based on Cid's theory and his assumptions regarding the Blight and the Mother Crystals. It's just hard to believe with that many people, everyone can just be in agreement about it. And of course, Ultima tells Clive and Joshua the truth of things, but by then, it doesn't even matter anymore. I was hoping once in a while it would be Jill, but she either completely agrees with Clive, or like when he's having like a crisis moment in Eastpool over Joshua, there's no advice or anything helpful said there. She just turns the conversation around on her and her plight. It's not like they bonded or both of them hating themselves for things that they did in the past or anything. Or, when we got back from the 5 years, Clive is again questioning, what they were doing. She puts them back with, Cid wants us to do this. We got to keep trying because Joshua saved us. Now, Jill did try to talk Clive out of the trap in Rosaria, so I will give her that one. So if not Jill, I thought, maybe Gav. Gav isn't like a conflict person, but he does bring fairly obvious things to light in his way. He sees things as they are. But that didn't happen either. And the last person I would think of, like maybe Joshua, because they do have differences of opinion. They did have the argument in Relude, which is very personal to Joshua after the whole Shiva thing. Unlike Clive, Joshua is very forward looking. He tries to understand what's going on. He tries to see the bigger picture of things. He knows that there will be a time that Clive is going to take the Phoenix. And Clive is just too one note to even see anything. He just knows what he has to do right now. And the whole time that we're going through Stone here, Joshua was really trying to reel Clive in the whole time. I was hoping that Joshua would be the voice that Clive needed. And a little, but it was also the perfect opportunity for them to have a little conflict. Because, Clive spent his 13 years as a bearer for the Empire, where Joshua spent his 13 years being cared for by people who worship the Phoenix. And he had Yote protecting him, so it was a whole different environment. Number 5, large bosses. And I mean really huge bosses and long battles. And they aren't any in 16. Now you can say Titan Lost could be one, but it's not. It's only long because of the unskippable cutscenes and cinematic classes, and even the combat felt scripted. Like you cannot freely attack Titan Lost any way you want it. Now you're running because the game is letting you run, or you're fighting on his arm or whatever. The Titan fight could have been in the open desert where they were, and they could just let us do what we wanted. Ifrit has like these jumps that he can do. They could have given Clyde access to the big jumping thing that we always see him doing. and then we can, you know, fight them properly. And, you know, 16 also, there was like no secret bosses or, you know, bosses that took like, you had to do certain things to make the boss appear. So there was nothing that we could just go up to and fight like that for like an hour or like 20 minutes. I don't want to fight anything for an hour with Clive. Clive does way too much damage for anything like that to even be possible. So 15, you know, it just had the big turtle, and Mantoise, I think that's how you pronounce it. You know, it wasn't a necessarily exciting fight, but, you know, at least it was just something interesting to do. And, you know, there was some others like the big bird thing you see at the beginning, Zoo. And you also get a bounty for it later in the game. You may actually see it twice, because I've seen it in the field, and then I saw it when we were going to get those gems for that guy in Galden. And you know, he's actually inside of a dungeon. And, you know, this takes me to the next part. Cities and dungeons. There were a lot of places in 15, but being able to revisit the few places that were there, what was an option? Like Altisha. We went there for the quest, but, you know, we could also go back there anytime we wanted, you know, and explore and do things or whatever that was there. And there's also the destroyed version of Insomnia that was also accessible. You know, you can always go back to it, right? And 15 didn't have a lot city-wise, but the older Final Fantasies, they did have more cities, and you can always go back to most places. And 15, of course, there were many dungeons, and, you know, some of them were part of the story, and of course, there were some that were optional, and all of them could be revisited anytime we wanted. 16 had many cities and towns, and unfortunately, all the big cities were only accessible when you were on the quest or in replay. You know, we can't freely explore them out in the world. Like we went to Oriflamme briefly in a cutscene, but we never actually went into the city ourselves. Now we wound up sneaking in some back way, you know, trying to get to Drake's Head. So there was Cosnes and Randala. Those are also two cities we heard about, and we only seen them in cutscenes. Rosalith, like the destroyed version anyway, we couldn't go back inside of it. Twinside, you know, we were in the city, but that was just for the chapter. You know, we couldn't travel, you know, the crystal road that Joshua was traveling on to see Dion, to even go up to the gates of Twinside. So, I mean, Twinside got destroyed, but before that, and, you know, there were also 0 dungeons. So I would have loved to like take Clive into like a Menace style dungeon with his abilities. I think that would have been like really fun. We're exploring always outside in 16. You know, we don't go inside that often. So there's no caves or old ruins that can be explored, but that can count as a dungeon. This could have been optional content. Just be out a part of the world, and, you know, none of that really existed. So that is my list. And of course, more can be added. But thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you more Final Fantasy content. Okay, bye-bye.